Vietnam is a long, narrow country in Southeast Asia, bordered on the east by the South China Sea. France occupied Vietnam beginning in the 1800s. But in 1954, the Vietnamese won their independence by driving out the French. By an international agreement, the country was divided into two areas: the north, ruled by communists, and the south, ruled by non-communists. America's President Dwight Eisenhower feared that if South Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in Southeast Asia might follow. So the United States supported the government of South Vietnam. Tension and violence soon flared between North and South Vietnam as communists grew frustrated at the failure to establish a unified nation. They established the Viet Cong, a group of guerrilla fighters that tried to overthrow the government of South Vietnam and put a communist government in its place. The United States continued to give economic and military help to the South Vietnamese. The summer of 1964 saw a turning point in U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The government received reports that North Vietnamese ships had attacked an American Navy ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. Lyndon Johnson, now the president, was determined to strike back. He ordered immediate airstrikes against North Vietnam. Soon, he sent tens of thousands of American troops to Vietnam, and the numbers rose even higher. By 1968, 500,000 American troops were stationed in Vietnam. They used deadly weapons against the Vietnamese and sprayed herbicides that killed the vegetation where the Viet Cong hid. But the enemy also had advantages. American soldiers struggled with jungle warfare and with a war that had no clearly defined battle lines. And they had a hard time distinguishing between the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong enemy and the friendly South Vietnamese. The Americans mounted search and destroy missions, hoping to weaken the Viet Cong and force North Vietnam to surrender. But in these attacks, many innocent Vietnamese citizens were also killed or wounded. As American involvement in Vietnam grew, anti-war protests took place back in the United States. The nation became deeply divided. On January 31st, 1968, the Vietnamese celebrated Tet, the Lunar New Year. That day, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers launched attacks on every major city in South Vietnam. This came to be called the Tet Offensive. North Vietnamese casualties outnumbered American losses by more than 10 to 1, but this was no victory for the United States. Americans were shocked that the communist forces were capable of such an attack. More and more people began arguing that American troops should be pulled out of Vietnam. President Johnson decided to stop bombing North Vietnam and call for peace talks. But the war continued. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office as president. He knew that a growing number of Americans opposed the war, so he introduced a policy called Vietnamization. Under this plan, American troops would gradually withdraw from Vietnam and leave the fighting to the South Vietnamese. But Nixon also sent soldiers into nearby Cambodia to destroy Viet Cong bases there. This action triggered a new storm of protests in the United States. In 1970, some anti-war demonstrations ended in tragedy when National Guard troops opened fire.
The National Guard and other law enforcers are harassed by rock throwing and name calling, and at Kent State in Ohio, 4 students are killed.
Pressured by public opinion, President Nixon announced that he would withdraw all American troops from Cambodia. A ceasefire agreement was finally reached in 1972, and the last American troops withdrew from Vietnam the next year. But the struggle between North and South Vietnam continued. With the Americans gone, the communists set out to seize control of the country. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, where the government formally surrendered. After decades of fighting, Vietnam was united under a communist government. The costs of the war were huge for the United States. More than 58,000 Americans died in combat, and some 300,000 were wounded. In addition, the war's $200 billion price tag damaged the U.S. economy for years to come.